So there have been a few new things around privacy and security in Koha, and there are already some options existing that you may not be aware of. So when Jonathan and I started talking about this, we were like, yeah, this would be great for a customer day. And when I started making a list, and the list grew bigger and bigger and bigger, and then Fiona said, oh, but you only have 30 minutes. So we're like, oh, okay. So this is what we'd still like to cover, but some of it we're going to have to cover quite quickly. But as Andrew mentioned, there will be some videos on some of those topics anyway. So those areas where we don't have time to tell you as much as we'd like, actually, we'll be able to tell you more in details in different ways. So just going back to the beginnings, in a way, is when we're talking about privacy and security and data protection, what does the law actually say? And just a quick reminder that the GDPR still exists. It used to be known as the EU GDPR, but for some unusual reason, it's now known as the UK GDPR. But it's still there, it's still the same, so we're still under the same rules. And we can, yeah, I'm not going to go into more details around what's happening with data protection legislation, but just, again, very quickly as a reminder, principles of the UK GDPR. I would really recommend you read Article 5. It's the best article in the whole of the GDPR if you're looking for some reading material. And it's highlighting the principles of how to process personal data. So personal data has to be processed lawfully, so you have to actually have a legal basis to do it. It has to be done in a transparent way, so you have to tell people that you are collecting and storing and using their personal data. You have to collect it for a specific purpose, and you have to, again, be clear and explain why you're doing that, why you need that personal data to provide that service, for example. You can only use and store what you absolutely need to offer that service. You have to make a commitment to make sure the data you have is accurate and keep it up to date. You can't keep it for longer than you need to provide that service. And you have to make sure you have appropriate security to prevent against access, like unauthorized access, but also against data loss. We all have heard of what happens if you're in breach of the law, so I'm not going to go into the details. Instead, I'm going to jump into options in Koha. Oh, no, instead, I'm going to tell you that there's more than the law. Because we as library and information professionals, we also have some additional principles that go slightly further than the law may require us to. So in CILIP's ethical principles, there is a mention that we make a commitment to uphold, promote, and defend the confidentiality of information provided by clients or users and the rights of all individuals to privacy. So these are the principles we abide by when we look at actually what can we do for our citizens and our users. But back to Koha. So the first thing you might want to be doing is actually inform citizens that you are processing their personal data. And a nice way of doing that is to use a cookie consent feature. So I'm going to try and jump out and show you an example on the British Museum Library website. And we must have been on this website before, because the cookie consent is... So if you go to the British Museum Library online catalogue, yeah, for the first time, you do get a really nice banner at the bottom where you can click for more information, and you get those buttons at the bottom as well to accept or reject. So that's one way. So that's already available for those of you who are on Koha 2111. There are two system preferences simply called cookie consent. Another thing you can do, and maybe we can look at Cheshire Library's online catalogue or trial. So it's simply to link to your privacy statement, and Cheshire Libraries have links in the footer. So because it's Cheshire Libraries, they don't just have one link, they have two links because it's two joint services. So it's another really easy thing you can do through the tools. Using the OPAC credits, you can add links to the footer. And you can either link to a PDF, a page somewhere else, or create a page within Koha to do that. Thank you. I think we just need to go back to the slides. Thanks. So that's just some options for informing citizens. And then other options around opaque usage, you have options to keep or not keep information about how your users are using the online catalog. So things around the search history or where they click, for example. And then it's also about giving citizens choices. So it's giving a choice back to citizens about what they want to do about their personal data. So you can do things like recording consent. You can create a patron attribute that says, oh, do they want to receive the newsletter, yes or no? And you can easily record that in the patron form. And you can also make that editable in the OPAC. So if they do change their mind, they can just log into their account and then switch back to no. You can also give library members control over which emails they receive, so that's in the messaging preferences. And again, there's another system preference that allows you to do that. And the opaque privacy system preference, I'm also going to try and go and show what it looks like on the trial system. But it's about, at the moment, sorry, in 2111, it's about the checkout history, so the borrowing history. And in 2211, it will also be about holds history. But when you're logged into your account, you've got another tab called Your Privacy, and this is where those options sit. So they can decide for their borrowing history to just never be kept. They can decide that they want to immediately delete it with this big red button. But if they just pick default, it just the rule you've chosen will apply, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So you can enable that again using those the system preferences, and when they do choose for their borrowing history not to be kept, it uses another system preference called the anonymous patron, which I'm going to explain in a moment. I'm just checking the time, making sure. Okay, okay, so the other thing in this section is about guarantees and guarantors. So the first question is, who needs a guarantor? So those of us who deal with younger library members under GDPR, the recommendation is usually that young people over the age of 13 are considered able to make their own decisions in terms of their personal data and how it's used. So like, does it fit with the way you are dealing with children categories and whether they need a guarantor at that age or not? And then there are also system preferences that allow you to give more choice to those young people who have guarantors. So does the young person allow their guarantor to see their borrowing history or to see their fines history as well? So you can give them that choice too. Okay, so in the principles of GDPR, there was something around limited to what is necessary. So it's also about how long you need that personal data. So the one thing you can do is when you're thinking about what personal data is necessary for you to keep or store or to collect, you can do some really easy things like when you're joining a new library member, either through the staff interface or using the self-registration on the OPAC, is thinking about which fields are actually mandatory and which fields are optional. So what is in the information that is necessary and that's going to be a mandatory field, and what information is not necessary, so you can make that field optional. And again, there are some system preferences that allow you to do that. And then if you really want to make sure you're not collecting extra personal data that you really don't need, you can hide the fields that you're not using. And again, you can do that both in the staff interface, on the patron form, and on the OPAC. And finally, if you want to do a bit of tidy up, you can also run a report on patrons that have data in those fields and make sure you clear that as well. So I mentioned the anonymous patron earlier. So this is the thing that's kind of all about the anonymous patron. And what it does, when you set up, you decide how long you want to keep the borrowing data linked to the borrower. And then after that period, it means these items will show as checked out by the anonymous patron, so that one patron that you set up. So you won't know who borrowed it before, you just know that it was borrowed at this date. If you need to keep a bit more information, so again, not necessarily the name of the person, so instead of anonymization, you can use pseudonymization, but that's one other thing I was worried I wouldn't have time to show you, so I'm going to skip that for now, but it exists and you can ask us about it. Okay, so before I pass on to Jonathan, and hopefully I'm just about right on time, we are talking about data protection and data retention, but how long you keep data after a while if you're either anonymizing it or not. Then the next step is going to just delete it. And I know some of you have got reports that you run regularly, and then you use the batch patron deletion. But you can also ask us to set up automated scripts to delete, for example, library members with expired accounts. And you can have slightly different rules about which categories of patron it applies to and whether they've got still items on loan, but maybe you still want to delete everyone after a while anyway. And there are other things you can look into deleting. So we're thinking about transactions and transactions data. I think that's the bit where I am handing over to you.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, as Aude was saying, I mean, the one thing we know is librarians, they love to keep data, and you know, some of the databases can get very big. Data retention has problems. Well, it has problems for you in terms of obviously the law, but it has been problems in terms of us in terms of technical problems. So the more data you're storing, the longer it's taking to back up that data. And the impact that has is if there's ever a problem, we have to restore the system, then it takes a lot longer to put the system back as well. So that's a sort of concern, I guess, a background concern. Slow queries is another one. So obviously, a lot of the time, you know, you're doing transactional data. You know, a lot of the time when you issue a transaction, it's actually having to go through and look back through previous data that's in the system. So again, the more rows that you've had, potentially the more amount of data you're looking back through. So we have a script in Koha called Cleanup Database, and this is specifically really designed for solving this problem. So it can pretty much clean up anything in the system, but there's a lot of things that actually don't really take up a lot of space. There's one or two sort of big hitters. The first one really is action logs. That's really the audit trail of everything that you do. So when you edit a catalog record, you issue a book, you know, create a purchase order, whatever, it's storing transactional data. The second one is really when you're loading batch imports of MARC records, because although MARC files aren't big, you know, once you start doing a lot of them, they start to become big. So those files sort of stay there and linger there until you actually delete them, clean them up. So that's two things, very obvious things that you can use Cleanup Database for to quickly sort of get the amount of data you're storing down. In the system preference, there's actually a tab called Logs, and it's worth, you know, just running your eye down here and thinking, actually, do I really need to actually log all this information? Am I actually even going to ever use this information? So it's worth just looking at that. Moving on from data retention, moving more on to actually the security of the system. So there's a lot of new things that have been added in the last year or so to Koha to improve security. So I was just going to talk about them in particular. In the way we handle and allow you to handle passwords has changed a lot. So you may or may not be aware of some of these system preferences, but I think you certainly should be. So things like the minimum password length, how complex the password is, whether you allow your patrons to actually change their password, reset their password, whether you notify a user when the password has changed. So you're probably all familiar with getting those sort of emails. You get an email where it says, oh, somebody's changed your password, just confirming it's you, are you okay with that? And obviously if it's not you, you ring up. Forcing password expiry, that's a new one that's coming in 22.11. And one thing that's also changed that I think has sort of frustrated some people, but it's a very obvious security measure, is in the past, in the welcome email and things like that, we used to send out the password in the welcome email. Now you're not, you're sent out a link for the user to set the password in the first instance. So that's an important one as well. Other things you can do to tighten your security, the staff client, again, you may or may not be aware of this, but the staff client, you can restrict it to nominated IP addresses. So if you only want to allow it to institutional IP addresses, you can put that kind of filter in place. Again, one of the things that's coming in 22.11 is two-factor, multi-factor authentication. So for the staff side in Koha, staff will now be able to use two-factor authentication, which is obviously a big change. For those people using Aspen, that is already there, so you can use it today if you want to use that. And there's also some ongoing development to add two-factor authentication to the online catalog as well. And then really finally, just to finish off, talk a little about how we actually store all this data. So Aude mentioned that one of the things that both we and you have responsibility is restricting unauthorized access to that data. So how we store it is important. I mean, the first thing to say, unless you ask us otherwise, we store all the data in the UK. So that's both you know, the original database and any copies of it. We keep copies of your database on your local system, and we also keep it on an off-site storage place, and we also keep it in another off-site storage place. And one of the reasons, you know, Stephen will be talking to us later about data centers. One of the reasons we use multiple data centers is in the worst case scenario where a large missile hits, you know, York or something, we've got another copy somewhere else geographically located. You may again already be aware of this, but we keep quite extensive archival backups of your system. So in theory, we can go back 6 months, right back 6 months if we needed to look for data. And importantly for you, that data is encrypted both on your server and offsite. So to actually be able to, even if somebody did manage to actually take that data, they couldn't actually view it because you need the encryption key to be able to do that. We do disaster recovery testing anyway of our own, but every time we do, say, a copy from your live system to your test system, then we record that in a log at our end, just to show that we've proven that that database is a database that we can restore back from. So that's important for our sanity more than anything else, actually. And some of you also have real-time replication as well. So that's a service we offer, a sort of additional service where every transaction is backed up, replicated in real time to a secondary server. So if those of you who do have that, that's a good sort of fallback mechanism. And in terms of restore time, you know, we want to be able to restore systems, you know, within 2 hours. And the restore point, we want to be able to go back, you know, at the very most 24 hours. And when you've got replication, you can actually go back to point in time as well. So that's what we're looking for. I mean, again, one of the reasons we don't want you to store, you know, huge amounts of data going back years and years is that obviously restore time is impacted by the size of the database that's trying to be restored and so on. Okay, I think that's, I don't know how we're doing for time, but I think that's all we've got.
So actually, I didn't need to hurry.
No, you could have gone slower.
Oh, we still got 10 minutes. It's fine then, because we have another section.
The bits we didn't have time for.
I don't know if it's worth doing.
Why not?
It's just...
This is the encore.
Sorry, yeah, I did hurry up too much, and I should have taken more time. So, yeah, for those of you who are so keen to know more about pseudonymization and how it works exactly, so I mentioned anonymization, where your borrowing data becomes, everything becomes borrowed by the anonymous patron. But sometimes you still want to know actually what kind of items were borrowed by this patron category, or maybe you want to know what happened at a particular library and you want to be able to do that back in time. And the anonymous patron kind of scraps all that because it's all become borrowed by this one patron at this one library in that one patron category. So instead, pseudonymization kind of copies data into two other tables, and it allows you to choose what information linked to the borrower record you want to keep about that transaction. So you can choose to keep the patron category, for example, the home library, the postcode, maybe some of the patron attributes, and it does mean you still won't know who borrowed that item after the amount of time you've specified, but you will know it was by someone in this patron category. You will know it was by someone whose home library is this library. Obviously, if you keep the postcode, that could give you a very precise idea of who the person was, so it's really up to you to knowing your user data, what would be the best thing to use here. I do have another slide in this section of things I didn't think we'd have time for, but I think it's probably less common. But there is something in the future that's hopefully going to make it really easy for you to deal with subject access requests. A bit more like you can have on some websites already, where you can download all your data from this website or tick which parts of your data you want to know about. Do you have any questions or comments on that?
It's a big topic area, there must be some questions.
Any takers?
Too scary.
They've all got their data beautifully organised.
Yes, well, maybe we are talking to the converted.
Yes. Okay, that's fine. Well, we're about 5 minutes early then, so we'll perhaps stop there if there aren't any questions.
All right, well,